Okay, so today you got a handout for exercise 111. It's not by any means the all-encompassing exercise, but it is designed for you to start collecting the things that you're going to need for your poster, and that way that you can kind of be thinking about it. So what the content that ends up on exercise 111 is not as critical as what you're kind of collecting and preparing for in that context. So we're going to start today with a lecture about graphic design. I'm going to get into more of the technicalities of graphic design, the structure, the organization of that, and how we might set up our work so that it's a nice logical format and has a nice hierarchy and good elements that can walk you through a particular graphic design piece. And so we're going to talk through a lot of that in the mechanical sense, or I guess in the theoretical sense first, and then I'll move into doing a bunch of work on InDesign and kind of showing you a variety of techniques that work on InDesign. So we'll start with our basic set of grid systems, and then I'll talk through a bunch of the terminology. You know by now that I really tend to focus on terms in the beginnings of these lectures so that we have some kind of a common ground that we can talk through. And when I talk about what a flow line is, you guys know what that flow line is, and you understand what I mean by that. So we'll start first with this kind of basic concept of margins. And margins are probably the one thing that you're most familiar with. If I asked you what a margin was, I bet all of you, how many people know what a margin is? Right? Pretty much all of you are going to raise your hand. Because it's something that's kind of obvious, we're ingrained in that field. Whenever we do a history paper or an English paper and we open up Word, there's a set of margins that are just default that are there. Well, margins are essentially the active area of a particular page. They define that. So it goes around your active page and says this part is active, this part is just the border for it. That might be the easiest way of describing it. Beyond that, they also vary in size depending on what you're trying to portray. Your English paper, for example, might have more around it, more of a margin around it than, say, your, I don't know, what are you guys doing a poster on right now? Your Barcelona Pavilion poster or whatever, right? You might have less of a margin around it because it's a different intended outcome, okay? It's also designed to direct you toward the actual live content, the stuff that matters. It can contain subordinate elements. Let's go back to the English paper or the history paper example. Maybe you're doing it where you have footnotes. Those footnotes at the end might end up in the bottom margin. Maybe you have at the top, you have a little header with your name and the page number or something like that. Those kinds of things end up in a margin, but it's okay that they're in the margin because they fundamentally are supporting the main content. So they're not the main content, they're just supporting elements. So we'll do the kind of live version here. Not that this is particularly challenging for you guys to know what the margin is. I've highlighted it in blue, and it goes around the area of this particular page. I'm referring to this drawing, which is actually a drawing that's out of the layout workbook by Kristen Cullen, which was the recommended book as part of this class, not required, but it was an extra piece. So if you feel like you're struggling with this graphic design stuff and you want an extra reference, I think this book is great. I don't make it a required book because it's really only valid during the InDesign graphic design portion of the class. It's less valid in the Photoshop or the Illustrator sections. So it's not something that you're going to use the whole time, but at the same time, it can be a really good way of kind of walking through this stuff. So we're going to use this graphic over and over again through the course of today as I talk through various examples. So if we continue on and we move into the realm of columns, right? Columns are vertical divisions of space that fall within a particular element. So in this instance, I have a couple different columns that are available here. So look at this image right here. That would be a column, right? And this section right here would be a column, right? Furthermore, if we look carefully, this right here would also be a column. So even though this has an image that's right there, that image still falls on one of those three columns that's defining this particular page. So those columns, you're probably all familiar with columns to begin with, but the idea of the column, right, is just that it's a vertical division of content. Okay? If you've read a magazine before, if you've read a newspaper before, they use columns. Okay? They're going to divide the page into multiple columns, or they could be just a single column. Right? Your English paper or your history paper is the easiest example of just a single column layout. Right? Just one column. Your widths probably are going to vary based on your desired outcome. So what are you trying to do with this? How long should a line of text really be? If you have a lot of text, a bigger column, i.e. your English paper or your history paper, makes sense. If you have a smaller amount of text, sometimes breaking it into columns makes it easier and quicker to read. Hence, a magazine or a newspaper. Okay? It also changes what content is available. If you imagine a newspaper, instead of having columns, having just one heading and then the stories just started from top to bottom, it would be hard to find what you were trying to read. So sometimes columns help in the general organization of things. Sorry, I don't know why it makes that noise. There we go. So if we were looking at the live example here, the columns would be each of those regions, right, highlighted in blue. If we continue on, right, column intervals, on the other hand, are the negative spaces that separate the columns. Okay? So they're fundamentally these little pieces that are right in here that separate this column, the pieces that are right in here. It's the space. And if we didn't have those little pieces that would be available between the columns, the text would just collide with the next line of text and you wouldn't know where to stop reading and where to start reading. So we need that extra little bit of space to be able to easily understand where those column intervals are. Right? It prevents this kind of collision from happening. You can also call these, beyond column intervals, you can call them gutter widths. And so the gutter width is basically an interchangeable term. If you're talking with somebody who's very classic graphically designed trained, they might call them a gutter width. So I like to bring up that it might be a gutter width for some people. But at the same time, a column interval works essentially the same way in terms of terminology. So if we were looking at the live example here, right, highlighted in blue, those would be the various column intervals or gutter widths, basically divisions of the column. We continue then further along with something called a flow line. And this is the if you have all these vertical columns, right, we need some way of breaking that set of columns with something that's horizontal. So in this particular instance, if I were looking at this, right, I'd have a column that's right here. Right? I'd have another column that's right here next to it. This would represent a column right there. This would represent a column. And lo and behold, there would be a third column, and that would be right here. Right? Likewise, there's a third vacant column that's showing up right there. Okay? So all of these elements are very vertical in their nature. Okay? We instead draw in a flow line or a break that goes right across the main part of the page, right like that. So that flow line does a lot to guide ourselves into what we're looking at on a particular page. Right? So just by that division, in this particular example, we can actually kind of guide our way into the page. It breaks up the columns. It gives us a natural place to change where the picture is, where the text is, and vice versa. Sorry, when I draw, it loves to make extra bumps. Right? So the flow lines there are these blue little lines that go across. The example that I showed is one, kind of one flow line. That flow line doesn't have to happen at the top third of the page. It could happen midway through the page. It could happen at the bottom of the page. It just depends on what you're trying to show and how you're trying to divide up the pages themselves. Okay? Grid modules are basically a combination of the flow lines and the column intervals. And they end up creating these little squares that then become grid modules that you can put content into. Right? They're spatial areas that support the textual and visual content of the design. Right? So they're basically the underlying format that you can then insert your content. Right? So I'm not going to go through and highlight every one of these because it would end up looking like just columns. Right? But it's the same thing whether it's up here, this blue square, or whether it's this white square. Each of those, right, separated by margin, column interval, flow line, and flow line, that gives us a grid module. So here's an example here. of a layout. We have our column intervals running like this, column interval, etc. Right? We have flow lines that run across there, flow lines that run across there, and as a result, we end up with our module. Okay? This might be taking it a step too far. It's very, plunk down square, square, square. When this really becomes powerful is when you use this as the backbone of your system, but then you selectively try to break it in a really nice, creative way. So in terms of working with our basic grids, we're going to use this to order and kind of unify the compositional space as a whole. So we're going to establish this grid as a backbone for what we're trying to do, but we're not going to be tied to it in a way that everything has to fit within this grid. If we have a piece that doesn't quite fit, we're going to break the grid and use that to our advantage. Okay? It should be the underlying structure without being super apparent in what we're trying to do. So if I went back a slide, this particular example to me is very apparent. There's a grid structure and this falls on the grid. If I went back several more slides to the one that I was drawing on last time with the flow line, that one doesn't really have a strong grid structure to it. I mean, it does behind it, but you don't see it the way you would in this particular slide. OK, so we don't want to just establish some kind of an arbitrary grid. We don't want to just slap a grid on without any context of what we're trying to use it for in the grand scheme of what's the content going on the page. So instead, we're going to determine the proportions of the grid, how big these grid modules should be, based on the page format and the complexity of the visual elements that we're trying to show on our particular page. So depending on what we're showing, we're going to use those to our advantage. Functions of grids, you guys essentially could come up with this list on your own, but it's a lot about general organization, structure, and rhythm so that your piece reads as a cohesive unit, especially when you have multiple pages that work together. So we'll start with the most basic form of a grid, and that is a single column grid. Right? It's perfect for really large amounts of text. It's no surprise that you use this as when you turn in, say, your English paper or your history paper. Okay? Because it's great for this big body of work. If we broke this 12-page history paper down into small little chunks, it would be much harder to read, right? To go back and forth across columns, etc. So we reserve the single column layout. Now I couldn't show you the traditional single column layout in the graphic design sense because it just is not very inspiring. So I showed you this example, which is definitely a single column, but it's got a lot of margin space around it or a lot of negative space around it. Makes it a little bit more exciting. But it's still definitely a single column layout. The margins often do need adjustments. So if we look at this traditional kind of book setup, and we look at it, the sides and the bottom tend to be rather classic in their layout. They end up being rather large, right? The top is usually a little bit smaller. So if we look up here, this part up here tends to be a little bit smaller than, say, the bottom. In this case, it's not too different. If we look at the inner margin, right, this would be the space that's right in here, right, and right in here. That inner margin is generally half of whatever the outer margin is, which would be the space that's out here, okay, or the space that's out here. So it's generally half in proportion. And I'm going to show you how to set this up a little bit further. The other thing is they're always mirrored across spreads. So if I divide my work by the page, right, well, remember one of these is the right side, one of these is the left side, right? Whatever the space is that would be right here has to match the space that would be right here. The width of the text that would be across there has to match up with the width of the text that would go across here. Does that make sense? So it's mirrored across that spread. Oh, well, I blew it up. I was supposed to draw on that slide, sorry. Such is life. So if we look at this one, this is the grid system how-to. I will walk you through how to kind of create this and set this up in the world of InDesign. It's a great way of kind of doing an initial layout of your work. I realized when I did it this morning, and you guys have a little bit of the benefit of me going through these once before already today. In this context, it's probably better that we reserve this for your portfolios than for your program postcard today. But at the same time, I'm still going to walk you through how we set it up, and then we'll do it again when we get to your portfolio and talk through. that. One of the key things that I use in this system when you actually draw it out, this is not something that I invented by any means, it's a known graphic design strategy, is I tend to use the golden ratio when I divide up columns, and that can help in the overall content. It just feels more right because it's a naturally occurring product. So given that information, there is one number that you need to remember. It's 0.618. It's the magic number for getting a golden section. So if you had a line that was, say, 4 inches long in total, and you multiplied 4 inches by 0.618, you'd get the value that you would need of one line versus the other line to make that golden section or that golden proportion. And so we'll talk about how that works when we get to the live example, but it's a number that you just kind of have to memorize. So when we get to multiple column grids, they tend to contain several spatial intervals, right? They're basically nearly endless in their compositional flexibility in terms of what you're trying to show. It's great for complex projects, and I'm going to show you a lot of examples of lecture series type posters. I think I used National Portfolio Day as the example posters, but in showing you these posters and over again with different variants on the same theme, it can kind of help you with your design for your lecture series poster for here, right? It's really easy to create movement, tension, drama based on this just basic layout strategy. So let's look at this poster a little bit larger and kind of dissect what's going on in this particular example. So if we look at this poster, we have a couple things. We have a series of columns that are occurring. So we have this would be one column, right? If I can draw here, that would be one column. We have another column that represents this text right there. We have another column that represents this column of text. And we have another column that represents this. Right? So it's easy to see the first three, right? This one, and this one. It's much harder to think of the text that represents the title block, this piece right here, as being its own column. But really that's part of this 4-column layout. Right? The other thing that we have is we have something that runs across right there as part of this design. What is that? You guys remember what that's called? What was it? Flow line. Perfect. Yes, it's a flow line. Right? So we're dividing this, and maybe I was off a little bit. Maybe I need to pull it back and redraw that to be right here. That flow line that's right there provides a great counterpoint for what's happening above versus what's happening below. And so as we look at this particular poster, it's really easy to focus in right on that point, right there. And that gives us a starting point to really read and understand this particular lecture, or this particular poster. We understand by reading from right here that this is a lecture series. Whoops, I drew something, hold on. We understand that this is definitely a lecture series because we've got the text about the lecture series there. We understand that the information up here is kind of extra. It's who's hosting it. But then we immediately move into these columns that represent who's lecturing and when. Below this line, which you could also call is almost a secondary flow line at the bottom here, we've got some extra information down here at the very bottom that maybe, who's sponsoring it and that kind of stuff showing up at the very bottom. So we're using this graphic design layout as a way of presenting this information and ordering this information, clearly representing it for the person who's viewing it. I should see if I can turn off the sound. Maybe that'll work. So as we move into the modular grids, we talked about this already a little bit because I showed you this image, but I'm bringing it back so that we can really talk about it. So when you get into the modular grids, the best example of which is this, because we've got all of the little grid modules kind of filled, it's easy to see. They work great as kind of a base layout for whatever we're trying to create. The other thing that helps is we can use these spatial units, but then we can choose to break the spatial units. Right? So we can choose, for example, to use, instead of a square and a square, right there and there, we can choose to have the text span all the way across this particular set of units. And by doing that, right, we've broken the grid modules. We could also have an image that spanned this whole set of modules, something like that instead. I should do that in a little bit darker pen. Right? We could go, instead of having 4 separate images, we could have that span. So we could work within the context of these individual modules and vary what and how we're using the various content. Apparently it still likes to make that noise. When we think about what the modules should be, or what the length of the modules should be, we want to think about two things. One is the length of the line of text. So imagine for a second that I wrote in 12-point font. You guys all know 12-point font because that's what you use for your English papers. And I started on this edge of the board, and I wrote a single line of text that went all the way to that edge of the whiteboard. If I did that at 12-point, in order to read it, I mean, unless your eyes are remarkably better than mine, you'd need to be fairly close to it. Maybe where I'm standing here, right? Not where you guys are sitting in the back. So I'd need to be close to it, but it would be really hard for me to read from here all the way over there. I'd actually have to walk along and read as I was walking to get all the way to this end. So the length of the line here would be much too long for me to actually be able to read it comfortably. Likewise, if I had a column that was really, really short, right, maybe one word per line as I went down, I'd end up with a vertical column that keeps going down and down and down. So to read a sentence, I'd have to read a really long length. And so in that case, the paragraph length would end up being too short, or the line length would end up being too short. So we're looking at a combination of what is our font size and how easy is this to read, and can I get enough of a sentence in as I go through. So when I define whatever my grid module should be, I want to make sure that I understand what that length of line really is and what's comfortable to read. Right? I don't want to make the grid too small such that I need more. I want to make it appropriate for the size of the paragraph. Okay? Likewise, the smallest photograph that you want to show is also important. So if I have a bunch of big images that I want to see, and I shrink them all down so they're 1 inch by 1 inch in these little tiny squares, I can never actually see all the detail that are in those photos that I need to see as part of this process. So you want to be aware of photograph size, how small are you really willing to make a photograph, and at the same time, how long is a line of text, and can I really read that line of text? Is it uncomfortable or not? Okay? Of course, connecting. So in this particular example here, I have a variety of layouts that are available to you. The ones up top are, let's say we were doing our portfolio, the final project for this class. You don't have the actual assignment yet, but if you did have the assignment, the portfolio would be a good way you're going to have to display the images that you shot as your best photograph. That would be assignment 101. Your Photoshop collage work that you did would be your assignment 102. Both of those are kind of photo-sized items. So chances are you'd want to use one of these big ones that's up here to be able to display that, because you want to show all of what you're talking about. So maybe this one here would be pretty good because you get a good amount. Maybe your cropping or something was such that you really needed the portrait or the landscape version, one of those two. If we were in that realm, right, that would kind of make sense. We have a little bit of room for titles and that sort of thing. Maybe your best photograph, you want to show the modified version, the one that you ended up creating, and that shows up in a layout like this. And then maybe the original version shows up in this upper corner or something along those lines as a way of kind of establishing it. Now, when we get down later on in the semester, maybe we're going to do, or we will end up doing, a bunch of collages out of SketchUp. Right? And you'll be doing 4, 5, 6 of those. Or maybe when we're in AutoCAD, we're going to be doing a floor plan, and then we'll do a bunch of elevations. Right? And so if we start to think about that, we want to move down into this lower section down here, right? Down in one of these, and we're thinking about lots of little images. So how small can we really shrink those images? Is it reasonable to show it? And one of the biggest problems in a portfolio style layout is you have so much stuff. Let's think you guys are all in 121 right now. Okay? So let's say you move on and you're doing your Mondrian museum. You built a model. You did drawings. Right? You did all this work that maybe you did a collage, right, of the model. Maybe there's a SketchUp model coupled with some drawings, coupled with the actual physical model that you laser cut. So you've got all this stuff, and you're stuck trying to fit it onto one page. One of the temptation is, I've created all this. It all has to fit on my page somehow. So somehow I need to cram it in, and you end up making all these little tiny boxes, and you can't really see any of the detail itself because everything's too small. So you have to learn to edit and decide what it is that you're going to do and what it is that you're going to show. So a layout like this might, even though at first glance that seems like what you want to do, lots of little pieces, maybe you'd be better off in one of these ones that's in the middle here, because in the middle right? You might be able to show one large image here and then a couple smaller images or a drawing, and they're still big enough for you to actually see enough detail to be excited to be looking at the portfolio. So it's not always about showing everything. Sometimes it's about showing what's appropriate, right? Or enough detail of a particular image such that it's valuable. And so you want to think about that. And sometimes you need more than one page, obviously. So we'll cover that when we get into the portfolios a little bit more. So if we're in this modular grid realm, right, we can increase our compositional flexibility a lot because we can choose to break this grid. We can put different elements on different pieces of the page. We can span multiple columns. And by doing that, right, we're able to create a really dynamic layout that is consistent page to page to page, but can vary a great amount with whatever content we're trying to put on the page. One of the reasons that I always do this portfolio as the end topic of this class, the end final project, is because you're going to have those photos from the beginning in assignment 101 and 102. Then guess what? In this assignment, 103, you're going to do a lecture series poster. That lecture series poster is larger. It's 11 by 17. How on earth are you going to put that into a portfolio? It's awkward, right? What about when we get to AutoCAD and you do a layout that's 24 by 36 inches? How does that fit into the portfolio? How do you accommodate that? Do you cut it up and rearrange it in the portfolio? Or do you try to include the whole layout? Then we move into the SketchUp section. You've got lots of little collages. How do you deal with those? So one of the reasons that the portfolio is such a great final assignment for this is you're dealing with such a disparate amount of things, different things that you're trying to put into one kind of thematic, linked graphic design layout. And it all kind of comes together nicely. Some of them turn out awesome, some of them not so good. We're going to spend more time this year, so more of you are going to have really good ones. That's the idea. So we also get into the world of alternative grids sometimes. And I would say this is one of the harder things for me to sit up here and try to explain to you how to do. Because remember when we were talking 2 lectures ago, and I was talking a lot about intuition, and you just kind of had to trust that gut feeling, and that's right, or it doesn't quite feel right. That is a perfect example of how it plays into graphic design with these alternative grids. So there's not really a scripted way to where I can say, oh, well, you just set it up this way, and it's this angle, and it's that angle, and suddenly you have an alternative grid. It's really based on intuition. This one is really nicely done, right? It looks good. Proportionally, it looks good. But I can tell you why it looks good, but I can't tell you how to do it, right? Most of the time, this kind of a layout takes time and time and time and iteration and iteration and iteration before you settle on this is the right solution or this is going to look right.
So the example you have right now, it's based on a horizontal and vertical grid that they just decided to not.
They deconstructed it a bit, yes. And so, you know, if we really stopped and we tried to analyze this, right, and we looked at this, let me blow it up so that I can draw on it, right? We do have some common elements. Well, let me go back to a pen, right? We have something, you know, essentially it's falling like this. So we have some strong flow lines that run across the page, right? This is obviously some kind of a column that's appeared. And probably, you know, that point is kind of a column. That point is kind of a column. So we can see that really this does have a bit of a grid behind it. But it's not as intuitive. It's not just a straight up grid. Some of the pieces are longer than others, right? I would argue that some of these proportions are designed based on golden sections, right? Depending on how you divide it up and where those dividing lines are. But as a result, you end up with a very dynamic. You have this one key element here. This is running off that way. That is going off that way. And that ends up being a very dynamic approach to how you're laying this out. And if you saw this page after page after page, this can start to evolve. And I'll show you an example on the next slide that I think is maybe a little bit easier to see. Well, no, I'll have one coming, right? I have this one first. This is a poster. This is almost impossible to make it fall into a traditional grid module layout. It just doesn't quite work, right? We can sit there, and I think I have it on the next slide in a larger format. I can sit here and I can try, you know, really hard to break this down and say, okay, well, I kind of have a column that's occurring kind of in there, and I kind of have a column that's in here. But really, those aren't the best solutions. Instead, I really have kind of a division that runs, if it'll let me draw, right? A division that kind of runs that way. It's a diagonal more than it is anything else. And then I have another diagonal that kind of runs back this way. So now I don't have a traditional grid anymore. I have these two diagonals that are kind of working, and then I have this other content that's up and down that's over here. So it's not really based on a traditional grid, right? The various text even, right? This splits and goes up. This doesn't even have another piece. This splits and goes up. This splits and goes up. So I guess in this context, there are some flow lines or some horizontal columns that are going across, but they're broken by this vertical column. So it's really hard to adapt this into a nice grid-based layout. But at the same time, right, let's clear this off here. If we just look at this poster, it's kind of a nice poster. It looks pretty darn good, right? It's interesting. It's vibrant. It has a lot of visual command to it that makes you want to look at it and maybe makes you want to go to whatever they're showing at this particular poster. But I guess what I'm trying to get at with a poster like this is it takes a lot of intuition and a lot of kind of trial and error to get this to look the way it does. Right? It's not just a one-liner. You have to be very good, you have to be diligent, and you have to keep working at it to make it fit in the correct sense. So here's the examples that I was going to try to show you of the deconstructed grid. Right? Sure, this has a bit of a combination of pages in terms of how she was able to set this up in context. But at the same time, it ends up being a really nice pairing of two different slides or two different spreads of a book. So we can see that there are common elements as I'm looking at this. Right? Obviously, I have a strong diagonal in this image. I have a strong diagonal in this image. They're both very, very different, though. Right? One is an image that's right there, and the other is this series of text that's much wider. But they both provide that kind of an element that goes from the top middle away from this page. Okay? They're also at different positions. Right? This one falls here on the page if this was the spread line of these two. Right? This one falls across the spread right here. This one over here is over on that side of the page. So they're different, but they follow a similar vocabulary, which can help a lot when you're doing this kind of deconstructed grid. I think this area in here is particularly nicely done. In contrast, the text is about the right size. The paragraph length works. And to have the image kind of sitting in here and separating this text, it works fairly well. But does this follow a traditional base? No, not at all. Right? It takes a lot of this intuition to see how it kind of works. Right? There is some general flow lines that are still used. Right? So if I clear this off for a second, right, there is a general flow line that goes across the page right there. Right? That same flow line exists in this image and goes across right there. Right? It's very similar in its placement, but you have to really stare at it to see that similarity. Do you guys see it now? Right? So that flow line still exists. So they're tying the pages together. Right? Likewise, the diagonal that's here is essentially the same diagonal that's right there. Right? So there's common elements on these pages, but it's much more reliant on intuition and what really looks right. And that's what makes it hard. We want to think about the grid as a base. So I'm going back more to the grid layout as opposed to the alternate grid, because I think the alternate grid is a really challenging one to just grasp and to actually use and to work with. So if we go back to the traditional modular grid with all of these pieces, what do we do to make it lively? What do we do to change it up and to make it a little bit more interesting in what we're trying to do? And what we can do is use that as a base, but not be stuck to it. Right? We don't have to just say, oh, here's all my modules. Let me stick in a little image for every module. What we're going to do is break the grid. And we're going to intelligently break the grid. So if we nudge a picture and it's slightly out of the grid, it emphasizes that one picture. Right? It's kind of like when you're doing your Mondrian museum. You guys haven't gotten there yet. Right? But you'll end up with a starting point of a column. It's a grid, basically, of columns. And if you take one of those columns and you move it slightly out of place, it can dramatically change that particular space that's around that one column. If, on the other hand, you move all the columns so that you lose the grid altogether, you lose the point. So when you break the grid, you want to be very intelligent and very selective about where you're breaking it and not just break it everywhere. Right? So if you're breaking it too much, it's the wrong grid to begin with. So let's talk a little bit about the interaction of visual elements and how we work with these visual elements to create the overall piece. The biggest thing that we want to start with is a hierarchical development of what is it in this particular poster or in this particular graphic design piece that we want to highlight and then what are the subordinate elements that come together. So if we look at this particular example, right, this book cover, the something for nothing, right, the number 1 element is right here, something from nothing. Okay? Something is number 1, from is number 2, nothing is number 3. And if we look at the boldness of the text, they're all the same size, right? But something, the first word is the boldest, from is a little bit thinner, nothing is just an outline. So we're working our way down in a hierarchy as we read it. And then obviously down here even further, smaller, right? We've got a little bit of extra information about the book. That's right there. So we're working our way down in this hierarchy. Let's look at this poster for a second. And I know I skipped a slide, but I think it's easier to see it in its visual form. What leaps out to you? What's the first thing you see as you look at this poster? Okay, I hear one answer that is National Portfolio Day. Well, what's the other answer? The flower. Okay, and it's really interesting because how many people think it's the flower? Okay, how many people think it's National Portfolio Day? Okay, about 50-50, right? That's okay because they're doing two things. There's two primary elements. Okay, there is the flower, which obviously grabs your attention. It's the big visual colored element. Okay, at the same time, we also have the text that is National Portfolio Day right here in the center. Right? So both of those items draw your attention not to the bottom half of the page. So if I were to divide the page in half, are you focusing on the top half or the bottom half? Top half. So we're focusing up here. So whether we looked at the flower first or we saw National Portfolio first doesn't matter, but we're looking at the right section. So if you saw the flower, the next thing you'd see is the National Portfolio Day. If you just ignored the flower altogether and just looked at that as something that grabbed your attention to want to look at the poster anyway, that's fine. But we're looking up here at the top. We're looking at National Portfolio Day. That's obviously what this is about. And then we move into the California College of the Arts hosts more information, subordinate element, right? And then we also move right here into Saturday, January 19th. That's when it's going to happen. Sub-elements. So we could gripe a little bit about which is number 1 and which is number 2 and which is number 3. I think I would argue that the flower and or the National Portfolio Day are item number 1. And then item number 2 is probably the date. And then item number 3 up here at the top would be who did it. Okay? So I have those elements clearly established. Now we get down to the lower half. So we divided this in half before. We get down to the lower half, and this is extra information. This is just other stuff. Right? I can't even read what it says, but my guess is this is what, a little description of what National Portfolio Day is or something along those lines. Okay, so it's a little bit of extra, and then whatever this stuff is down at the bottom is maybe whose portfolios are being shown, or it's much less important. So one of the principles that I like to use and or describe relating to this is 12-6-3-1. Okay? And this works as well on your lecture series poster as it will on your final design project in 221 when you're doing the skyscraper, right? Or you're doing something in 220, it'll work the same way. And that is that when you go to look at your design and to decide if it looks right, look at it from 12 feet away, right? We, by our nature, are always looking at stuff here, right? You work on your computer, you stare at it. You zoom in, Control+++. Oh, this is perfect, right? That's our nature. We always do that. But it's very rare, especially when we work on the computers, to stand back and say, what's it look like from 12 feet away? Okay? The truth is that when you come in and you do, let's say, a review, you're in 121, the reviewers come in and they're going to talk about your project. Okay? They're all sitting down somewhere between 6 and 12 feet away from your drawings, correct? They're not right in front of them. Okay? At the same time, you're sitting there, and the reviewers are either, oh, why do I want to be here? I don't really want to listen to you talk. And you're up there talking, and you're like, please pay attention to me, right? And you're talking. The reviewers are either like that, or they're kind of engaged, and they're kind of interesting, and they're kind of half listening to what you say, right? The truth is that they're only half listening. I would be very surprised if anybody was actually really listening to whatever you say, because we love to be distracted when we're reviewing. And I'm just as guilty as anybody else, because I've sat on a lot of reviews, and I start looking at the drawings, and I start looking at stuff. Okay? The other thing that will absolutely almost always happen, certainly if you're in a review with me, it will happen because I will do it. but it may happen for other people too, is that somebody who's been sitting, watching, listening will get up halfway through your review, right? And they'll walk up to your project and they'll start looking really close at something. Has this happened to anybody yet? It will, if it hasn't yet. They start looking to these little tiny details, okay? That's the 1 foot level. So you want to have something on anything that you're doing, whether it's a poster, whether it's your final design project, whatever it is, you want to have something that's readable from 12 feet, something that's readable, it gives you a little bit more when you get to 6 feet, something that's a little bit better when you get to 3 feet, and something that you're like, wow, this is really cool when I'm at 1 foot, right? And I don't even see that item that's the 1 foot item when I'm 12 feet away, right? It's that extra little bit, and we love that. Okay, so this is a great principle when you look at that. So let's move forward a slide here, and let's look at this poster as an example. So in this context, what would be the thing that grabs you most? It's a little hard because it's kind of cut off. Sorry, I need to shrink it down. Right? Could be the birds, and I have a little bit of a gripe about this poster because I think the birds are a little bit on the distracting side because they're kind of all over the place. But if we look way up here at the top, all the way cut off, right, I have something for National Portfolio Day right there. Of course, I just colored it in yellow, so that doesn't work. Hold on. Right there. No, still not working. Maybe that. Right? All my colors are wrong. That stands out. If it wasn't cut off by the projector screen, that would stand out at you. It's black. It's different. Then we have the next level of elements, which is where, when, who. Okay? Then we move down into all this stuff that's along here on the side that really doesn't matter so much. But if we look at this from the 12, 6, 3, 1, right? Maybe from 12 we see the birds. We're kind of like, hey, that's kind of cool. And then we look at it 6 feet and we say, okay, National Portfolio Day. Oh, it's January 15th, 2005 at the CCA. Okay, that's kind of interesting, right? And then I move to the 3 feet and I start to say, oh, whatever this says? I don't even know what that says, right? I see that at 3 feet, and then I move up to 1 foot and I see this stuff. So you see how I'm designing for those levels? It's a really great principle in designing presentations to do this, right? It'll make your presentations much, much better. So we want to think about a hierarchy. So when you sit down to design your particular lecture series poster, your program postcard, whatever it is, think about what are the most important elements. What are you trying to get across? What are you trying to show? So if I were doing this particular poster, number one most important element would be it's National Portfolio Day. What is it? Perfect. Next most important element, maybe when. Right? Third most important, where? Right? Somewhere in there, I guess, who hosted it, but that's probably not that important. Right? And then we move down into further and further levels of detail. So as you start to establish and figure out whatever it is that is your poster, you want to think about these things. So lecture series poster, what's the most important thing?
What it is.
It's a lecture series. Number one item, I need to know it's a lecture series. Number two, right? Who's speaking maybe? Maybe where they're speaking, depends. Number three, what they're speaking about, more information about them. Number four, right? You kind of can establish this sort of a list. It's not a bad thing to put a bullet point list together and say what is most important, what is next most important, etc. If you understand what those are, it makes this really, really easy. So we'll talk about these compositional factors in a little bit more detail. That's kind of the overview, but let's talk about them in their specifics. So we'll talk about space. Space provides the visual contrast that we need for our active elements of the page to actually breathe and live and be interesting to look at. Okay? It contributes to this effective ordering system. Right? If we establish this hierarchy and then we cram everything together so it doesn't really fit, right, or it barely fits on this particular page, we're not going to see the hierarchy, it's not going to read well, and we wasted our time. If we have space around these elements, they'll start to live really nicely, right? Empty space brings things and makes things alive. Same thing happens in the world of architecture. If you have space around your architecture, it activates the space, right? If you have too much, it can be detrimental too. So you want to focus on the negative space as well as the positive space. Do you guys understand what negative space and positive space are? Great, right? Anybody not know negative and positive space? It's okay. It's fair enough. This is entry-level class. Anybody not know what I'm talking about? Okay, good. I want to go through it. So I have a blank page here. If I were to put an element on this particular page, right? Let me we'll draw in red here. Okay. Let's say that I put an element on this particular page, and it looks like that. Okay. This is the active element, whatever it is that I've done, right? That's the positive space of this particular page. On the other hand, just by putting the active element on the particular page, right, I've created a negative space that is everything that's not that. So it's all of this space that goes around my object. So not only do I have positive space, the active element, I have the negative space that goes around the element. And both are equally as important. Without the negative space, we don't have the good positive active space, right? This will change. Let's say instead, right, I put an image. Hold on a second here. Right, I put something right there on the page. It's not all that exciting. It's right in the center of the page. If instead of that, I put something here, whoops, that was wrong. Right? Now this is off center, and I've got all this extra space that's going around it over here and over here that starts to activate this and draw my attention. It's the same thing as the principle of the layouts that we did when we were in photography, rule of thirds. If you put something dead center, right, there's no space around it, it doesn't activate the photo. It's just a generic photo, somebody in the center. So by moving it off center, we start to have all of this extra space in here that can really make a big difference in making your piece live. Okay? So we have this positive and negative space. So let's continue on. Right? It's imperative for the accessibility of whatever the content is or whatever you're seeing. Okay? It directs you to the visual elements on the page. I really like this example here in particular because, right, the most important element in this graphic design piece is the negative space that's right here. Right? It's right there in front of you, but that guides you with where to start reading this particular piece. If you started reading up here at the top, you'd go, what on earth is that? Right? I would argue that you can't even really tell what it is. However, if you start reading at this negative space right here, you could say, oh, masterpieces, right? And then we can move back up and we can see whatever this is, the masterworks by so-and-so. Okay? So it's that negative space, that empty space, that actually causes you to look at something and to know where to start on this graphic design piece. So I think it's a particularly good example of that and how it can be effective. When we use space, we want to think about grouping elements together to provide some kind of a focal point and then have space around them. Right? We also want to think about not centering the object, but to keep that object off center so that the space isn't even around it. By making the space different around it, we activate the space rather than negating that. If we place something off center, right, that makes a big difference. If we have too much space, that also makes a big difference. Right? Too much space can deactivate. So if we go forward to that blank page again, and I were to draw something, right? Let's say that I draw a little itty bitty square like that. Right? The space around it is way too much. All of this space is way, way, way too much for that little piece. If instead, however, I have a nice big element with some other stuff in it, right? Maybe another piece that's here and another piece that's here. Suddenly, having this little bit of space, let me change color here to highlight this a little bit better. Suddenly having this space here, the little bit of a gap between these two, and this along the edge, it starts to activate the overall composition just by having that. So we want to think about not the little itty bitty thing with lots of space, but a proportional nice amount of space that breathes with our particular project. Then we want to think about scale. So we talked in the typography section of the class that even if we took the same type and we just varied the size and we created a ratio between the heading, the subheading, and the body and the footer, right? Just by varying the size, that's enough to give us a good, strong hierarchy. It's a great way of establishing that. One of the other things about graphic design, and this is something you'll learn in your portfolio project, is there's two different ways to kind of establish a particular graphic design piece. There's an additive method and there's a subtractive method. And it's where do you draw the line of how many elements are too many? Okay? For me personally, I tend to use the subtractive method, which means I throw absolutely everything I have onto the page first, and I say, oh, it's too crowded, and I pull something away. And I say, oh, it's still too crowded, and I pull something away. And then, oh, it's still a little too crowded, and I pull something away. And eventually I'll get to that point where, yeah, this looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with it. Okay? The other way of doing it is to put one element on the page and say, is that enough? No, it's not quite enough. Let me put one more piece on the page. Not quite enough. One more piece. Yep, that's perfect. Right? So that's an additive method. Any way that you do it is fine. There's not a right answer. There's not a wrong answer. It's just important to kind of recognize which way you work and then use that to your advantage. We want to think about the orientation and position of elements as well. It leads to a strong contrast that can provide the focal point for your particular image or your graphic design piece. Right? For example, if you have a bunch of horizontal elements, when you add a vertical element, that provides the point that you focus on. If you have a bunch of vertical elements, you provide something horizontal. That's what a flow line does, essentially. So let's look at this image big for a second and kind of analyze it. So as I'm looking at this particular image, right, I have lots and lots of text that runs horizontally across the page. There, down here, down here, down here. Right? At the same time, I have a really, really strong vertical element that runs right across here. Okay? When I combine the horizontal element that is here with the vertical element, I get a point at which I start looking at this. And they did a nice job by making the text go backwards and forwards. But that little point becomes the nexus, the key point that I'm looking at in this graphic design piece. And then I work my way around this particular composition from that point. Okay? So the strong horizontal contrast against all the, or excuse me, the strong vertical contrast against all of the horizontal pieces. We can also do something with depth and perspective. This is essentially moving things back in space as if, maybe in a photograph or something. So in this case, I have various little cards. The ones that are closer to me might be more important. The ones that are further away are less important. This kind of went out of fashion in maybe 2012 or so when Johnny Ives, the lead designer of Apple, decided that Apple was going to move away from the world of kind of three-dimensionality and back into the flat UI. And then once Apple did it, everybody kind of followed suit, and now it became the trend. So this is kind of out of fashion for now, but it's certainly something that still works as a compositional strategy and is worth mentioning in the context. Typography is as important as I devoted a whole lecture to typography. So I think type and fonts and how you choose to do that is just as important as ever. Don't forget everything that we talked about. Make sure you think in the macro and micro scales as part of this context. Okay? We want attention to the very smallest details, the kerning in between two letters, and also the overall, does the text look, does it flow, is it readable, did I pick a serif font, did I pick a sans serif font, all of those kinds of questions. Color is also really important in the graphic design sense, so maybe you introduce a particular color. It's hard in this class because there's so many things that I want to cover and I want to talk to you about. Color is one of the things I want to talk to you about, but I haven't been able to talk to you about it yet. It comes in about lecture 117 or something, 115, 117. We'll spend a whole day talking about color and what do colors mean and how do we work with colors and how do we pick a color and all that sort of thing. But at this point, we don't have that knowledge, but you still might consider adding a colored element as part of a focal point. It's particularly advantageous if you have a lot of black and white to suddenly have a color. Right? If you do too much color, obviously it contrasts and negates. The other thing that happens is a lot of times you want to add some kind of a little graphic shape that gives you a cue as to where to start or where to read. And one of the things that I see in portfolios over and over again is that this is overdone. There's too many shapes. And before you know it, you have too many lines and too many little dividing pieces and too many little pluses and crosses and minuses and whatever. It can be overdone. So you want to be very careful when you choose to do this and not overdo it. But at the same time, it can be very, very effective. So in review, if we're looking at this, you as the designer, number one, need to create some kind of a strong hierarchy that explains the elements and that walks the people through what it is that they're trying to see or to view as part of your design. Right? Then you want to go and you want to control and order that information such that it's in a way that makes it gripping, something that you want to look at. Right? Where do you start and how do you move through those elements? Then you're going to use the contrast to establish the focal area. right? Where am I starting? I'm looking at this poster. What do I start looking at? What's most important? How do I see that first? Okay? Then you use all those compositional factors and support that design as a whole. Right? So you take all of that together. So let's look at some examples. I like to show the portfolio style example so that you can kind of see how this works. So in this particular context, we have one page. It's divided up into our 4 columns, right? Which of course you can see, right? We've got our 4 columns here. The next page that comes over here still has those 4 columns. And those 4 columns, right, match up. They're just laid out differently. The photograph spans all 4 columns, right? So we're breaking that 4-column grid. Let's move forward for a second, right? And we can see some similarities, right? Only in this case, we have a single column of text rather than the 4 columns. So the 4 columns came together, melded, and became 1 column, bigger body of text, right? The flow line still runs across the top of the page. It's the same as the flow line on the last one, right? Likewise, we have a similar element here that kind of makes that upper corner, spans all 4 columns, but we still have cues of the columns down here in the text. All right, we'll move to the next slide. Again, same general layout. In this case, we flip the page. We have the big body of text on one side, but we still have those 4 columns that we can see. So if I look at it here, right, there's 1, 2, 3, and 4. Sorry for my drawing there. We still have a nice flow line that runs across this page right there that ties it all together. But we have this great little element that sits on top of everything else and spans a couple columns. It's breaking that grid and drawing our attention to that one little white box. Oops, I went too far. Right? Same flow line here running across the page. Similar, just a smaller column of text. So you can see how this as a body of work uses the same basic vocabulary for all the pages, but each page is different. So it's not about just filling in those individual little modules. It's about activating the space and working within the context of the different varying content that you have. Right? And when we get to the portfolio, I'll emphasize this even more. Right? Again, another page from the same book. Another page from the same book. Flow line maintaining. If we go backwards and forwards, we can see that flow line continues. Right? We've got that flow line up top across that text. As we go forward, that flow line exists. Right there. Same thing. As we move forward, that flow line is right there again, going across the top of the page. So there's consistency page to page to page, but the layout's varying a little bit. So they're working within the context of that grid. OK, so we're going to shift gears a little bit, and I'll tell you what. Let's take a quick break, maybe 5 minutes, and then I'll go into the world of InDesign, and we'll talk about how do you actually do this and create it. OK? OK, so we're going to start in on exercise 111. The bulk of what I'm going to do in the world of InDesign today is try to introduce you to a bunch of different tools. And it's not my goal at the end of exercise 111 that you'll have the most beautiful architecture program postcard ever. It's my goal that you will have explored and played around with a lot of different ideas for how you set up your work in InDesign. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open up InDesign to start. So let me go ahead and launch InDesign, Adobe Design Standard, and Adobe InDesign CS6. All right, so there we are. I'm going to go ahead and create a new document. Maybe. And so we're gonna work in here, and I'm going to start with just a half letter because I want to show you that basic strategy for how you divide up the spread with the golden section and whatever, like I said I would do. I will do this again in a portfolio lecture so you can see me do it again. But it brings up a lot of good strategies for how you can create guides and shapes and stuff to work with that don't end up printing. So even though we're going to ultimately do a 4x6 little card for today, I'm going to start with a half of a letter sheet because it makes a nice set of spreads that I can then work with. So I'm going to pick half letter. I'm going to set my margins here at 0 because I don't want those set. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And I am going to leave facing pages checked. And I get the single page if I click on the Pages window over here, I'm still in typography from last class, so I'll stay in that for the moment. But if I click on Pages, I see that I have page 1. And if I come down here to the little new icon, I can add page 2 and page 3. So I just click on the new page icon twice, and I end up with page 2 and page 3. I'm going to work on pages 2 and pages 3 for right now. I'm going to ignore page 1 because I want to work on this spread as a whole. Okay? So I'm seeing pages 2 and page 3. I'm going to click over here below pages to something called layers. And so we've worked in layers a lot in Photoshop, and you're certainly familiar with layers in Photoshop. But layers in InDesign and subsequently layers in Illustrator are very different in how they kind of work and how they function as a stack. So layers that are on top of other layers obviously have elements that are on top of other layers, same as Photoshop. The difference here is in the world of Photoshop, we have one object or item per layer. In the world of InDesign or in the world of Illustrator, we can have lots of items or images or whatever on a layer. So multiple objects versus single objects. So in this context, we have multiple objects. But I have some flexibility in how I work with these layers as well. So right now, if I click on layers, I just show layer 1. That's the only layer that's being shown. If I want to add a layer, I can click on the new layer icon. It's the same little icon as creating a new page. And now I have a layer that's layer 2. If I double click on layer 2, I get the layer options dialog box. And here in the layer options dialog box, I could, for example, rename the layer. So I'll call this layer guides. And my color right now of the guides layer is red. That's fine. And when I come down here and I look at these checkboxes, you see how there's a checkbox for print layer? If I uncheck print layer, whatever I draw on this guides layer won't print when I go to make an export. So if I just go to File, Print, and I send it to the printer, it won't show up. If I go to File, Export, and I make a JPEG of it, this won't show up. So it's a really safe way of having a layer that doesn't show up, but I can have it as content as part of what it is that I'm drawing. So we're going to go ahead and make sure print layer is unchecked, and I'll say OK. And you see that instead of the layer being in regular font or in regular type, it's italicized, which is trying to tell me that this particular layer won't print. Okay, so it's another little cue. So making sure that the guides layer is active by making sure it's highlighted in blue, I'm going to come over here to the line tool, and I'm going to draw a line that goes from this corner up to this center. But before I do that, I want to change the color of the line. Right now it would show up as black. So I'm going to come over here to my stroke color, or my line color. I'll double click, and I'll make that line red. And so now I'll drag a diagonal that goes from right here up to that point, like that. And I'll drag another one that goes from that point down to right here. Okay? At the same time, I'll draw a line that goes from this side over to right there, and another line that goes from this corner back up. So I've basically crossed my two pages like that, and then I've also created a line that goes to the center of this particular page. So now I'd like to switch out of the pica units into actual real units that I can understand. So I'll switch to inches by right-clicking in the little crosshairs on my rulers and switching to inches. And then I'm going to drag a guide, a ruler guide, from my ruler. So I'm going to click and drag over onto my page. Now, if I'm outside of my page, my ruler guide will be larger than the page and continue off in both directions. If I'm inside of the page, it will be clipped by the page. And you can kind of see how it appears or disappears. It doesn't matter which one you choose. You just want to be aware that there are differences in how you set it up. So in this particular context, I'm going to be outside of the page. And I'm also going to hold down Shift as I do this so that my guide jumps to my ruler lines. So I'm going to go a ½ inch from the inside of this page, right there. And I'll drag another guide and go a ½ inch on this side. So the center of the spread is that purplish line. And now I have a guide on each side of the page. Chances are your guides will be in cyan color, so they'll be a light blue color. In my context, because the projector, I can't show you guys the cyan. It just kind of vanishes. I've changed my guide color to be red so that everything I'm drawing is red. It's much easier to see on the screen. OK, so now I'll come up to the top, and I'll pull down another guide. And so here's an example where if I'm inside the page, I'm only getting a guide on the page itself. But if I'm outside the page, I have a guide that goes off in both directions. And I'm going to create a line that crosses right where those 2 points are. Okay. Now I'll create another set of lines that go to that point there, and another one that goes to that point there. So I've established the upper edge of this active area of the page. Now I want to establish the lower area, so I'll drag another guide down to where those two meet there. So what I've essentially done is I've taken this spread of pages and I've made two content areas on the page. So I have one content area that is right here. Oops, sorry. There we go. And I have another content area that is right there. Oops. Like that. So I have these two content areas. Those are the active areas that are going to be on my page. Let me move this over a little bit so you can see it, and let me zoom out a little bit so you can see it. There we go. So I have the active content areas, but I'd like to divide those active content areas a little bit further. So let me go ahead and delete this for just a second. And I'm going to look at this yet again. It looks like I lost one line. Hold on a second. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to do one more thing. Right? I'm going to measure from here to know what that length is. And so if I were to zoom in, I could see the rulers. This falls on the 6, and I go up to the 10. Really easy math. What length is that? 4 inches. Okay. So remember that magic number, that 0.618 that I told you about earlier? If I pull up a calculator, and I take 4 inches, and I multiply, if I can find it, by that 0.618 equals 2.472. So I need a line that goes over 2.472 to divide this by the golden section into a large column and a small column. Right? So I'm going to draw with the line tool. I'm going to start at this edge. I'm going to draw over. I'll hold down Shift so that it's accurate. And you see in that little gray box, I actually get a number. So it's increasing. So as I continue, I'll get to 2.47. Right? If I keep missing it, I may have to zoom in a little bit. Let me create it again and zoom in. So again, I'll start there, and I'll come over here, and it was 2.47. So now I have that length. And I'll drag another guide to the end of that, which is effectively dividing my columns into one column and then another column. I probably need a little bit of space around that guide. So let's go ahead and add maybe a little bit of spacing around that. Something like that. And I need to repeat this on the opposite side. So again, we'll do a line that starts here. 2.47, there it is. And we'll do a guide right at the end. And then we'll add a little bit of space. Something like that. And so now I've divided this up. Press Control minus so we can zoom out a little bit and see this as the whole page. I've divided this up into several different active areas. So I have one active area that would be right here. Oops. I have another active area that would be right here, the mirror image of it. I have another area that would be right here. And I have another area that would be right here. So now I have these that are mirrors of each other that are really laying out rather nicely from a graphic design sense because I'm using that ratio. So let's go ahead and let's delete these again. The last thing that would be nice to add would be some kind of a flow line that runs across the page. So let me drag a line down to where those two intersect. And then I'm going to split the difference between these two by dragging one more down and splitting the difference. It's about right there. So now I can have an active area at the top of the page that has my headings or whatever, and then I can have areas down here as part of the columns. So now that I have this kind of laid out as a general guide, now I can start filling in actual information on this particular page. And so like I said, you don't really end up with a spread today, but I like to show you this as part of this overall layout concept. Okay? You could certainly use it as one of your examples for how to create a 4x6 card. So I'm going to move my work layer back to layer 1. Okay, remember, guides is not printing. If I click the little empty box next to guides, I can actually lock the layer so that I can't actually select it anymore, which is what I want. So it's locked. I can't select it. And I'm going to work on layer 1 to actually start to create my content. So let's look at this page first. Right? And let's put some text into the page. So maybe I'll start with a text box, and I'll put the text as part of this column right here. Now I need some text to put into this text box. So for right now, I'm just going to throw some characters in there so I don't lose it. And then let's go online. Maybe I'll go to the DVC architecture website. And we'll click on this mission statement. Here's some text that I can copy. Now, it's not my goal to make you sit down and actually have to write anything, right? So you're more than welcome to borrow stuff that you found, text that you found for this exercise. And I'm going to come over here. I'll select it, and I'll go to Edit and then Paste so that it shows up. And I may or may not be able to include all of the text, but I've at least got part of it available here. And so maybe after that, I'd really like to add a little image. So I'll use the image frame, and I'll add a little image over here in the side. And I'll go to File and then Place. And let me drop in some kind of an architectural image. Remember, I can right-click. I can go to Fitting. And I can fill frame proportionally. And so now I have a little layout with a column of text and a little tiny image. Okay? Maybe I need a heading that goes above over here. Let me use my text tool again. We'll start up here at the top, and I'll do something that says maybe DVC architecture. Or maybe better yet, let's say Diablo Valley College, and then architecture. I'll make the Diablo Valley College larger in size, so we'll increase the size. And then architecture is below that. And I have this currently at the top of this little thing. So if I were looking at this particular page, and I wanted to see all of my red lines go away, because they're kind of distracting, I can go up to the View menu, and I can go to Screen Mode, and I can switch from Normal to Preview. And when I do that, all of those extra guides go away, and I can actually start to see my overall layout. Right? And so maybe this heading needs a little bit more, or maybe I need to adjust the size of the fonts or something like that. But it's starting to look fairly good. Right? Maybe I end up needing, let me go back to View, Screen Mode, Normal. Maybe I really need this to be further down, and maybe I want architecture to go on top of Diablo Valley College. And again, I'm kind of making this up as I go. Maybe this belongs there. And this whole thing belongs down a bit, up a little bit more, something like that. You change the space. Yeah, something like that maybe. And again, I can go up to View, Screen Mode, Preview, and I can see what that looks like. I actually don't like that at all, so I'm going to go back to the other way. There we go, something like that. Okay. Now let's say over on this side I wanted to add some pictures. So let me go ahead and go to Screen Mode, back to Normal, and I'm going to start creating a few picture boxes. So here's a frame. We'll start right here, and we'll add an image. And maybe I'll take that image and I'll copy it and I'll put it 3 times. So there's a second image and there's a third image. Okay? And so I could go ahead and I could place the content so that it's easier for you to see. I'll go ahead and do that. I'll go to File and then Place, and I'll place an image. I'll go to File and Place, or Control D, and I'll place another image. And I'll go to File and Place, or Control D again, and I'll place the last image. Okay? And then I'll work on each image, and I'll right-click, and I'll go to Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, and then Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally. And so now I have those 3 images. Maybe I need a little bit of text to identify what these are. We go ahead and create a new text box right here at the top. Maybe something like that. And we'll change our justification to the right. And we'll say this is San Francisco. Let me change my font maybe to like Arial. And we'll type and so I have San Francisco there written, but I want this to be like a subheading, so I'm just going to change this down. Maybe it's going to be 8 point or 7 point, something like that. So I have San Francisco and I have night. Let me take this and I'll edit copy and then edit paste. So I have a second version of it. And I want this to end up over here. And then I'll edit copy and edit paste to end up with a third version. And maybe instead of night, this says Victorian. And this says Golden Gate Bridge. So you see I'm working within a certain framework and a certain context to start to create this. So let's have a look. Let me go to View, Screen Mode, Preview. And you can see that I'm starting to use this as a general layout strategy. And you can see that this page belongs with this page, or they're working together as part of this. Okay? So now I have a problem because I have this image, I have this image, and I have this image, but there's different space between the images. Okay? I'm going to use a different technique to kind of work with these images. Let me go back to my screen mode normal so that I have all of my lines. And I'm actually just going to go ahead and turn off the guides for right now so that you guys can see a little bit easier what's happening on these pages. If I switch out of the typography workspace and I switch into the advanced workspace, when I do that, I should, and hopefully this will happen for you, I should get the Align window, which is a little floating panel, to show up. If it doesn't show up, you can go to Window, Objects, and Layout, Align, and that will show up. Okay? With the Align window selected, I can work with groups of images to do some alignments. So let's say, for example, that this image, say that this image here I threw on the page, and this image here I put on the page, something like that. Okay? I want all of these images to line up with this on the left side. I can click on the first image, hold down Shift, second, and third image. Okay? And I want them to line up with this image that's on top. If I click one more time without holding down anything on the image that I want to stay in place, it will highlight in kind of blue. You see how that blue highlight shows up around it? That is then the key image, or the image that's not going to move when I do my alignment. So that's going to stay in place, and now I can align all of my images to the left. They'll all line up right along that line. Now, I already had these lined up correctly, so it wasn't too hard. It wasn't a big challenge to get them to line up, but they are. Now let's look at the spacing between these images. So right now they're very different in terms of spacing. I have a couple options. Right? Let me move this one up for just a second so that it matches up with the end of this column over here. So let's say that these were placed such that they weren't even in spacing. See how this has a smaller gap than this does? If I select all three, and I look in the Align window down to where it says Distribute Spacing, and I uncheck the Use Spacing dialog box here, if I click on this icon, it will then center the middle object between the two outer objects. Okay? The other option that I have, and I would need to pick a key object for this. This is the object that's not going to move. So let me select 1, hold down Shift, 2, and 3. There. This is my key object. It's highlighted in blue. I can check the box for use a specific spacing. And once that is checked, I can type in a value for that spacing. So in this case, I want it to be 1/8 of an inch. And now when I click on the distribute spacing, it will make sure that those are exactly 1/8 of an inch apart. So it makes the alignment of these images really, really easy. Now the good news is, since we're in CS6, or if you're at home and you're in CC, there are a bunch of guides that can help us align our images to begin with. Just by dragging an image, you'll get some little green guides. It's really hard to see on the projector, that will help us line up with other objects. So relatively easily, I can line those up, and then I can go to View, Screen Mode, and I can go into Preview, and we can see what those look like. So I've worked on establishing that hierarchy. I have those 3 images. I've controlled the space between those images. They're exactly 1/8 of an inch apart, right? And I can work within this context. So let's move on, and let's actually start working on a 4x6 drawing for right now. So I'm going to go to File, New, Document. This is just going to be a single page, so it's no longer a facing page. And I want to do a width of 4 IN by a height of 6 IN. And remember, InDesign automatically converts my units, so as long as I type IN, I'll get inches. I want to make sure that I turn off all of my margins, so I'll go to 0 on all of those. And I'll go ahead and say OK, and that'll give me a single 4x6 postcard to work with. If you wanted to do it in landscape format, that's perfectly fine. Okay? I'm doing it in portrait format as the example. So let me go ahead and switch into inches so that I can see this. And now I want to kind of establish the grid modules. So it turns out that if I wanted 3 columns on this page, and I wanted them separated by 1/8 of an inch, I could do, I think it's 1/8 of an inch, I could do grid modules of 1.25 by 1.25. So 1 1/4 inches by 1 1/4 inches. So what I'm going to do is I could actually click and try to drag and find 1.25 by 1.25 in that gray box, but it's a little bit too hard. So instead, I'm going to click on my rectangular frame tool, and then I'll single click, and it'll give me a rectangle dialog box that I can actually specify a value. So I'll say 1.25 by 1.25. And I'll say OK. That then gives me one nice even frame that is a square. I'm going to take this, and I'm going to Control-C and Control-V to have a second version of it. I'm going to Control-C and Control-V again to have a third version of it. Okay, so now I'm going to use those align tools to get these objects aligned. So I haven't paid too much attention. I don't have a background set of guides to work with. I'm just going to use the align tools. So once again, if we switch to advanced mode, they should show up. If they don't, you can go to Window, Objects and Layout, and then check the box for Align, and you'll get this little floating dialog box to show up here. OK, so I'm going to select all 3. We'll start with this object as the key object. So again, I've highlighted it. And then I'll align all the objects to the top. They're all at the top. And then I'll distribute spacing with 1/8 of an inch so that they align sideways. Now, of course, I've done this before, so I happen to know that this will work in a 4x6 card nicely for me. But if it doesn't quite work for you, you may have to do some modifications. Okay? So I now have these 3 that are working together all nicely aligned. Let's say that I take these 3, and I Control-C to copy and Control-V to paste, and I have another set of 3. Okay? They happen to align the same way here, but I need to distribute the spacing between them. So if I were to select these objects, pick this as a key object, I could then distribute the spacing at 1/8 of an inch there. I could select these 3 objects, click this as the key object, and then align to the top. So now those 6 objects are aligned together with an 1/8 inch in between. So let's take those, and I'm going to copy again, Control-C and Control-V. And let's put this all the way down at the bottom. like that. So these are pretty good. This group needs some love. So let's go ahead and move these up. I can select them. I can move them up. I want to distribute everything. Well, here we'll pick these three. That's my key object. Distribute with 1/8 of an inch. There they are. Select these three. Key object, align to top. Select these three. Key object, align to top. So I very quickly created this modular grid that I can work with. So each one of these squares is a grid module. I have a flow line that could occur at any one of these locations as I work on it. So now that I have this established, I can start to use this as the base for what I'm working with in the world of InDesign. So let's say that I need to have the text show up, and I'd like the text to span down, say, one side of the page. Right? I can draw a text box on top of these that went the length of whatever it is that I wanted to draw, and then I could paste in that text from the website. There it is. Control-C, copy it. Let me jump back into InDesign. Control-V, and you can see that that's showing up across all of these little frames. I could select it and make the size a little bit smaller. Maybe it needs to be, 10 point or 9 point or something. So maybe 9 point, something like that. We could delete this little piece. If I decided that this really wasn't working for me, I could adjust the size. And the good news is, since I already have these kind of set up, I could say I want it to take up both of these. Maybe I want it to just take up that section. Right? And so the text. If I went to my View menu, and I went to Screen Mode, and I went to Preview, we'd see what that starts to look like. Okay, so let me go back to View, Screen Mode, and let me go back to Normal. Okay? In reality, I probably would need a little bit more space so that those don't go off the edge. So I'll give myself a little bit of extra space. So now, maybe I want to place an image and have that image take up this whole bottom, for example, or maybe just this bottom row. I could create a new frame that spanned all the way across, or I could adjust one of these frames to go all the way across. So we'll adjust that all the way across, and then we can go to File, Place, and I could place in, say, the Golden Gate Bridge. Right-click, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, and now I have the picture of the Golden Gate at the bottom. Okay? Sometimes you might want an image to take up more of these grid modules, but to still have the margins in between. So let's say I wanted an image to take up this, this, and this, so it would span across all of these. I can select them, like I just did, and I can go to the Object menu. I can go to Paths, Make Compound Path. And when I do that, the X that used to represent all of those individually now becomes one large X. You can kind of see the telltales of that. If that's selected and I go to File, Place, and I were to drop an image in, that image then spans all of those grid modules. Let me right-click and go to Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally. And so you can see that that's now spanning all of those individual pieces. And obviously, I could put a single image here. We could go to File and then Place, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally. And then we could look at this as an overall layout. Let me press Control-0, and then View, Screen Mode, Preview. And now we can see what it's starting to look like. So you see I was able to keep these borders in place. So that may or may not be an advantage. Okay, let's say that I wanted to start to break this down so that I really wasn't doing any of this anymore, and I wanted to explore the alternate grid setup. Let me just create a new page so that I don't lose what I was working on here. Let me go back to my View, Screen Mode, and I'm going to go to Normal. Okay? Now in this sense, I want to draw a shape. And basically any shape that you draw you can use as a frame to include a particular image. So let's say that I want to draw a shape, and I'm going to use the pen tool. We're going to cover the pen tool very in-depth when we get into Illustrator, and at that point when you come back to InDesign you'll be like, oh, this is so easy. Right now the pen tool is going to be a little challenging, But what you're going to do is click on the pen tool, and then click where you want to start, and click the next section of the line, say maybe here at the corner. Let me click up to right there. We'll go over and back to that point. So I've essentially created this shape. Once I have that shape, it can act as a frame, and I can go to File, Place, and I can put an image inside of that frame. I can right-click, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally. We get that whole sliver. I could do the same thing with text. Now notice this does, if I went to Preview, let me go to View, Screen Mode, Preview. See how it has the black border around it? If I wanted that black border to go away, I'd have to click on this frame, and then I'd have to change the border, which is currently black, to be the red slash. To do that, I can click this little black box below, click and hold, and say Apply None, and I'll get the little red slash, and that border will go away. Okay, if you get a little lost in that, I can help you with how that works. So I can come back to the pen tool, and I can come up here, and I could draw another triangle that went like this. And I could take that, and I could go to File and Place, and I could place another image in. Or I could come over to the Text tool. I could click inside of this shape, and now this becomes a text box. So I could go back to my text, copy it, come back here, and I could paste it so that it goes in that kind of diagonal manner. Okay? This may or may not be what you're actually trying to do. I'm just trying to show you options that are available for you. Once again, I can make the border go away by selecting the stroke color and then selecting Apply None. And we can see that I now have this kind of diagonal text working for me as well in that context. Okay, the other thing that may be something that you want to do, let me create another page here. Maybe I want to use my text as a frame for my objects. So let me say, create something that says DVC. Oops, see? And let's make it, I don't know, for lack of something better, I'm just picking a big, bold font. And let me make it large, much, much larger. Apparently that was too large. All right, so there it is, DVC. Maybe that's a little big. Move down a bit so it actually fits. OK, so I have this text that says DVC on it. If I want to make this a frame, I can go up to Type, and then I can go to Create Outlines, which then converts the text into actual shapes. And when I do that, I can use the shapes and go to File, Place, pick my image, and let me right-click and go to Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, and now that then cuts out my particular image. So the point is, pretty much any shape that you could possibly create, you can use as a frame, whether it's for text or whether it's for a photograph. So I want to present you with those options. Obviously, we started with how to kind of create the grid and work with the grid, and then we deconstructed all the way through. So today's goal in exercise 111 is to really play around with what works and what doesn't work, make sure you can do all of these various skills, because when we get to doing the lecture series poster, you may or may not need certain skills. And you might be really happy that you do one thing, or you might be unhappy that you do another thing. If you're trying to do it today and it doesn't really work out, that's the exact purpose of today. So if something doesn't work out, no big deal. Right? This is a trial and error sort of period. When you're done, if you've created multiple cards, that's fine. You can post them all. If you've created just one, that's fine too. You're going to go to File, Export. You're going to pick JPEG. Make sure you save it as a JPEG. When you do that, you'll be presented with these options. Quality is maximum. Resolution is 300. You'll go ahead and export it. Notice if I have multiple pages, I can choose to export all of my pages, which means it'll create a JPEG for each page already for me. If you had a spread and you wanted to show the spread together rather than as individual pages, I could check the box for spreads, which would be the two pages together rather than a single page. And so depending on what your output is, these are your various options. Okay? So I know that I talked a really long time today, and I know it was a lot to take in, but at the same time, there's a lot of stuff for me to try to show you and to talk to you about. The good news is, as you can see by the handout, it's not particularly long, right? It's not long-winded, so you should have plenty of time in your remaining hour and 10 minutes or so to get a nice exploration of these things and actually be able to put them together as part of a postcard. Okay, are there any questions? No? Okay. I will stop talking now.